Welcome to this review of Tanith Lee's Elephantasm. This is not my first attempt at making this review because essentially every time I start it ends up being a review of Tanith Lee, so I should probably consider doing that sometime. I do feel like I haven't read enough of her work to really do that adequately, but then who has? So, Elephantasm by Tanith Lee. Here you see one of my very few and very rare hardcovers. Oh, you can't see it, it's reflective. And you've got this beautiful lush cover. This is only one of two Elephantasm books that I have ever encountered in the wild. The other was a paperback with the exact same artwork, and I'd say it's probably one of her rarer books. You've got that big ghost elephant in the sky. You've got an Indian princess lying on a burning pyre of what is flowers, not coals, though I'm not sure that the camera's going to focus enough to let you see that. You've got this beautiful, lush, tropical-looking purple background, which is trying to suggest India, successfully, I feel. And it's a wraparound, so you've got this pretty little shrine in the background. This hardcover started life, as you can tell, as a library book. Here in the back, along with a picture of Tanith, who's a beautiful woman, you've got proof that I didn't steal it because it's been cancelled from Glenelg Public Library. That would mean that I've had this book probably since the early 90s when I lived in Sydney, Glenelg being in Sydney. I really like it. I have always really liked this Tanith Lee. I've been rereading it for decades now, which is scary. A lot of Tanith Lee's work I do like. Tanith Lee as an author is odd. I remember her as an author that I really love, but some of her books are quite difficult. And I think a lot of people will feel that way about her writing. But it's always erudite, it's always beautiful, it's always lush and exotic. And this is a lush and exotic story. Like many of her books, it's often cruel and barbaric. And if you are a woman, the last thing that you want is to ever spend any time as a protagonist in a Tanith Lee book. The things she puts her women characters through are insane. Elephantasm as well. The themes are subtle. There's that strong India connection, like you can tell from the cover. Does this review have spoilers? Well, I guess, because I'm going to talk about it. But this book is so obscure and self-referential and twisted and turny that I'm not even sure you can spoiler it by reading it. I don't think it spoilers itself. However, if you have not read it, then you probably don't want to watch this video if you're planning on reading it soon, so go away, read it, come back, and watch this video while you're sitting there stunned, thinking, what on earth have I just read? Which is what I thought the first couple of times I read it. Now, it's an exceptional book, even judged against Tanith's other work, all of which pretty much is exceptional in my view, in one way or another. But Elephantasm does stand out in a couple of different ways that I'll highlight while I'm reviewing them. I took notes, you see. It stands out from virtually all of her other books that I've read, which are not, unfortunately, all of them. Tanith Lee has never been easy to find in Australia, as I was chatting with the NT guy about recently. She's always been hard to find in Australia. I gather she's now even becoming a little bit difficult to find in the United Kingdom, and she was a United Kingdom author. But she did go through a lot of publishers, and she has such an ephemeral online presence, it's a bit hard to find out what books she actually has. I've never seen a full bibliography of hers online. And a couple of years ago in the library, I found 2 books of hers that were published in the 2000s that I'd never even heard of, from a publisher that I'd never even heard of. Anyhow, what kind of book is this one? It's complicated. Tanith Lee, I think, is known primarily for her fantasy, but she does do a lot of horror, often of the subtler, more psychological kind. She may be better known for that in some circles. She's considered a bit of a goth icon because of her, I think it's the Flat Earth series that she did. But she also had some great science fiction. Her science fiction tends to be my favourite of her work. She's got kids' books, she's got young adult books, she's got literature. Elephantasm is certainly fantasy of the more supernatural variety, very subtle supernatural variety, but still. It's got a very solid wedge of horror heading right in there, so definitely go with the horror. And because it so thoroughly breaks all boundaries of expectations and themes, I think it's very fair to claim it as literary fiction, because it is beautifully written, and the lushness of the writing is probably what you're going to enjoy about this book, if you're going to enjoy it. If you are someone who likes a lot of answers and everything explained, I suspect that this book will not be great for you. It does edge a little bit more into the psychological horror than some of Lee's other books, but yeah, I think it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous with a content warning, a huge content warning. So there's definitely SA, some of it quite nasty. There are very strong SM themes. They're not terribly graphic, but they're there and they're a bit warped and twisted. I think that any book by Tanith Lee probably should be approached with caution, with an inherent trigger warning. Even some of her younger audience books have got twisty stuff, but this one definitely. So, as it is quite difficult to find out much about Tanith Lee anyhow, Elephantasm is probably one of the harder ones that is to find out anything much about. So if you do read it, you're probably going to read it cold, aside from videos like this, which have not so far spoiled it. Casual Google brings up nothing about Elephantasm except its year of publication, which was 1993, and it was published as a standalone. It was published as a standalone during what was a bit of a lull or a dip in Tanith's career. I think she started publishing in the 60s, that might have been the 70s, and she was a bit of a publisher darling up until the 80s, when large numbers of publishing houses changed their modes and motifs, and even companies she'd worked with before were less enthusiastic about her proposals than they had been. Smaller publishing companies sometimes published a few of Lee's work, and this has led to her work being spread over so many of them and so hard to catalogue. So all these refusals and downturns did not actually stop her from writing. She kept on writing, and she kept on producing both novels and short stories. And I think what really resurrected her were the internet sales, which was when people who loved her writing or intrigued by her writing started looking for her online and finding some of them. Okay, onto the spoilery section. Elephantasm, as I said, many unusual things from Tanith Lee's usual verve. So maybe in this one she was trying out new themes in order to attract publishers that weren't attracted to her previous work. 1993, and it starts in England. Historical fiction style England, without much supernatural or weird about it. Now, I've never actually read another Tanith Lee which starts in a real country in a real time. So having it start in England, it was startling the first time I read it, and it's been startling every time since. I'm guessing that the England is the England of the 1950s. It would seem to be set in the era when England still had the Raj over India. So that would be before 1857 probably, because 57 was when the big mutiny occurred. There's a little mutiny mentioned, but it just seems like a bit of taklif or trouble that's happening. So India, the Orient, and culture are very much the supernatural and the lush aspect of this story. But it doesn't have an accurate description of India. It doesn't go into the politics. It doesn't really go into the country as another book like MMK or Howard, I believe, would write a country. It's basically a supernatural, almost subconscious seething of jungle and animal and strangeness. So an accurate description is not where Tanith takes us, and almost all of the India sequences take place in one small outpost with a few small characters and one or two gods. A shrine to Ganesh is mentioned. There is an almost stereotypical English guy with us. He's there because he wants to find gemstones and he believes there's shrines full of treasure. There's a local, not Raja, but Lord, who is Muslim, which is interesting because even when I'm not even sure if Tanith ever went to India, but she describes it very well. And they're these small giveaways. If someone was just writing an India book based on not very much research, you'd expect all the characters to be Hindu, I guess. But the way she puts in different types of characters with different motivations doing different things is interesting. Anyway, so that is all in the past. In the present, we start with our main protagonist, Annie Ember. Annie lives with her beloved sister Rose and Rose's horrible husband, who's ironically named Innocent. Again, that's one of those little Tanith quirks that make her writing so rich. Annie and Rose's mother has died. She never met her father, who was apparently an Indian officer, so there's the Indian connection there for Annie as well. Now, Annie Ember is the main protagonist in the beginning that takes us into the middle of the story. She vanishes a little bit later on, but generally her thread runs throughout the story. Tanith is known for a whole heap of different things in her writing. Wiki calls it frequently remarked upon for its use of rich poetic prose. Absolutely striking imagery. Yes, critics have described her style as weird, lush, vibrant, exotic, erotic, rich, elegant, perverse, and darkly beautiful. All of that. She used poetic and descriptive techniques which match the themes, and she's got heavy mythic characteristics in all of them. Some critics counter that her style is not always easy on the reader, which is absolutely true, and she sometimes leaves the reader with unanswered questions. You get all of that. I would argue with the sometimes leaves the reader with unanswered questions. I don't know that I've ever read a Tanith book and not ended up with unanswered questions. I think they were her main motif. As well as the beautiful and the lushness and the poetic and all the rest of it, she also does a kind of casual brutality that can be extremely disconcerting if you're not braced for it. And that's where we come back to Annie Ember and her sister Rose. Rose is beaten by her husband. He's a horrible person. He's forced his wife to prostitute herself to bring in money. He's just, imagine one of the nastiest kind of 1950s lowest of the lows echelons of English male, and you've got Innocent right there. Though he's described as strangely beautiful, and Rose is obsessed with him. Here is the theme. No, I'll talk about that later. So, Rose is continually beaten by her husband. He would probably be sending Annie out to prostitute herself as well, only she isn't attractive enough, we're told. And eventually, Rose kills her husband in a strange combination of self-defense because she's being beaten so badly and because he's about to start on her sister Annie. Now, 1950s, remember, women weren't real. They were just possessions. And so Rose ends up being tried and hung for murder. This sequence especially is where Tanith Lee's feminism comes out. I was surprised when I discovered in my 20s or 30s that Tanith Lee was considered a feminist author, because like I said, the things she puts her females through are horrific. It's taken me a while to recognize this type of storytelling as having a feminist theme by putting all these truly horrible things that were daily affairs and not even worth remarking on into her books. She is doing a very subtle type of feminist theme. It's taken me a while. I think I've got the hang of it now. But they are not easy to read. Often. Anyway, having sat through all the trials and watched her sister being condemned out of the mouths of others and never given a chance to speak, Annie has been taken in by a woman to whom they often sold their sewing to get money. And this woman sends her to be a maid in a remote house. The families she's been sent to, the Smolts, have moved back from India. And that is where a completely unconventional Eastern type of fairy tale type mythology comes into the story. Still as amoral and brutal as ever, mind you, but hey. So Annie's background explains why she's trapped in this place and doesn't escape. Physically trapped in that she believes that essentially the whole world will go against her, probably because they would, but also because she is still trapped in her own grief about having lost a beloved sister and the manner in which she lost her. She has no emotional outlet, and she is completely and utterly shut in. Without that, her staying in that location would not make a lot of sense. So when the family moved back from India, their husband the family aren't accepted by the local English gentry. The guy is thought of as a stepped up guy who made his fortune over there, but he's obviously lower class, sweepings of the street type of thing. He married a woman, Flower, who was on the stage, so obviously she isn't up to gentry standards either, but they've got 2 sons and a daughter and a lot of money, with which they built this amazing, elaborate mockery of an Indian palace on an English countryside. So you've got domes and you've got lushness and you've got mementos brought back from India, and the setting becomes part of the lushness of the whole story and the strangeness as well. Because in general, while India got into Mr. Smolt's soul, he didn't like India. Neither of the older parents did, and only one of the sons, Rupert, did. And it's warped them all. So the family she serves has this huge India connection, with the husband having served there, and the daughter, by the way, is one of Tanith's better psychopaths. She is completely and utterly crazy in a weird way. She's got this connection with her cat and almost no connection with humanity. And one of the things I found most eerie the first time I read this was that when Annie is elevated to the upper house, one of her jobs is sewing for the daughter, and one of the things the daughter wants is she wants all these bones of dead animals sewn into her underwear. It's that kind of book. So the daughter's Elizabeth Willow is a psychopath. One of the sons is a total English pig. The other one is addicted to drugs and strange sexual practices and is really, really odd as well. I won't go into that anymore. You should read it. There are no nice characters. That is an absolute underlying principle of almost all of Tanith Lee's work. You very rarely find a character that is likable, relatable, or in any way nice. Here, once again, we're a bit different, because Annie is not an unlikable character. And if you can fill in the blanks of her background, you can understand who she is and why she is. And she's a far more relatable character than I think you get in the majority of Tanith's work, certainly in a lot of her earlier work. The other thing about that is that Annie gets something approaching a happy ending. I think this might be the only Tanith Lee book in which the main protagonist is given any sort of hopeful happy ending. So yes, no nice characters. Now, yes, comment about the India connection. In this day and age, cultural appropriation is a big thing. This is not a book from our day and age. It was written a long time ago. I've seen some reviews where this is a problem for some readers. They're sick of English people writing about India, or they're sick about hearing mythological stories about India when they haven't been there. I don't know. Tanith Lee uses this Oriental occult theme, and that really spoke to me when I read it, because I'd had a fascination with India for a long time. I'd read a lot of books about it. And while this mythology is someone else's version of India rather than a version of India from someone who's lived there, I did find it really enjoyable. If that sort of thing bothers you, however, it might not be for you. To me, who has lived in the tropics, the details of a tropical location are beautiful and exceptionally convincing, which made me wonder if Tanith Lee had ever actually been there and was describing things that she'd seen and smelt and heard, but I can't find any evidence for that one way or another. Perhaps you know evidence for it. Do please send me links if you do. So she's written India so strongly that you can't just think of it as an anonymous fantasy land, but it is a very fantastical land. And this story is essentially a revenge story. So while they were there, the Smolts did some horrible, horrible things. Mr. Smolt especially did some very bad things in India, but essentially none of his family were exempt from doing not great things, even the two boys. So the final thing he did was a horrible insult to a beautiful young woman who was considered in her community practically a god herself, if not a holy woman, and an insult to the shrine of Ganesh, and hence the elephant theme. And he becomes the arm of revenge, and it's in a weird way. So this is totally a spoiler, and by now you should have gone away if you mind about spoilers. In the very beginning, in England, London I think it was, Annie accidentally finds her way into a shop that is like an emporium of delights and wonders. And in there, she ends up buying for a penny a tiny sliver of ivory on which an elephant is carved. And it becomes clear that through carrying this tiny sliver of ivory, which is practically all she possesses, to the Smolt's house in rural England, she has carried the revenge of India and gives it the chance to rise up in the English countryside to exact revenge on the Smolts. And it does that by slowly spinning the household out of control. Rains come, the English countryside starts being a jungle, the animals that appear in jungles like wild boars and tigers start appearing, and the house starts crumbling down. It's never thoroughly explained, it happens slowly, and with this lush, exotic take that Tanith is so well known for. I would call it horror at its most insidious, but the reading experience is lush and beautiful. So I keep using these same words over and over again. But yes, it stands out for me as an unusual Tanith Lee in that it starts in a real place, England, in the 1950s. The India is a mythological version of India rather than a real one. But the revenge theme, which is not uncommon in Tanith Lee's works, seems much more linear and comprehensible in this one than in many others. And again, it finishes on something that is, if not a happy ending, at least a hopeful future ending. So if you really like happy endings and you want to read a Tanith Lee, maybe start with this one. So, one more word about Tanith Lee. Every discussion of a Tanith Lee book ends up, with me and my sister at least, being a discussion of Tanith Lee herself. She's like a few other authors, I'm going to say Poppy Z. Bright, who the two don't really often differentiate themselves. So, Tanith was a really amazing author and highly underrated, I feel. Of all the books of hers that I've read, I haven't always loved them all. I remember her as an author that I really love, but not all the books as I read them do I enjoy. Birthgrave, the first time I read it, I absolutely loathed it. It's one of her most famous ones. The second time I read it, I only disliked it, and I still don't know that I've read it for the third time, but that will come. I've never got rid of it. So even when I don't like her book, I keep it and I reread it, and that's strange. Her science fiction ones are my favourites, but if it isn't for her actual science fiction one, like the B4s or the Silver Metal Level, those types of books, I'd have to say that this strange combination of history and fantasy and mythology would have to be my second favourite of hers. I like this fantastical India and this lightly touched upon historic England better than I like a lot of her fictionized worlds. So, Elephantasm by Tanith Lee, beautiful book. If you find it, I suggest you buy it. I would also recommend you read it, but because her work's getting so rare, if you're a book collector and you find a good one in good condition, I would say collect it for its own sake, and then pass it on to someone who might read it. Thank you very much for watching this long, rambling, probably not terribly well put together video. It's been a long time between videos for me because I've been reading long books, and now I shall go on to another book. Have a great day, read good books yourself.